My name is Pedro de Anda Plasencia. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm super excited to be moderating our LGBTQ plus panel, aligning your career with your whole self. And I'd like to thank all the panelists, all the alumni and students for attending tonight. I'm super excited for the conversations that we will be having tonight. And today we will be hearing from four amazing panelists who will share their wisdom on how to be true to yourself as you enter your career journey and how to be true to your identities. As Yo-Yo briefly mentioned, I'm a senior who's going to be graduating, and as a gay Latino, I really value representation. So it's really helpful to learn how other people have been able to stay true to their identities while navigating their spaces. So having set that context, I'm going to pass it over to our panelists so they can briefly introduce themselves, starting with Ari.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Pedro. So my name is Aria or Ari. My pronouns are my name, they, and them. And I currently work at the Women's Foundation California as a program manager for our Women's Policy Institute state program. So we're a nonprofit, so that's my industry. And I started there about 2 years ago, first as a program assistant, and kind of got there by just being really into what they had on their website about who they served, and being very clear about prioritizing systems impacted communities and BIPOC and LGBTQ people. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for your intro, Ari. And now if we could also hear from Derry.
Hi, I'm Derry. He, him, his pronouns. I'm an executive coach and organizational consultant. And my clients are looking at their lives from the perspective of social justice and strategic leadership and change. That's who the people I enjoy working with. I was in the business school, the Haas Business School MBA program, and there I majored in organizational behavior and marketing. And I'm here because I think it's important for you to have choices, have options. And I think in listening to us, you will hear a lot of different ways to navigate your career. And I think it's important for you to be able to make the choices that work for you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that wonderful intro as well, Derry. And now if we can hear a little bit from Natalie.
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Natalie. I use she, her pronouns. I graduated in 2011, and I majored in psychology and got a minor in global poverty and development at the time. I actually currently work for the campus, so I came back as a staff person, and for the last few years, I worked for the Path to Care Center, which is the on-campus crisis center for sexual violence, domestic violence, relationship violence, invasions of privacy, stalking, et cetera, and recently shifted into the Clery Division, which is a federal mandate through the Department of Education, named in honor of a student who was assaulted and murdered in a dorm. And so there's now all of these public safety measures enforced by the Department of Education that every campus has to comply with. And so I'm working on that end of things now. And this panel, immediately, as soon as I saw the opportunity to join on this panel, I reached out, because I think so many of the questions that we're going to go over today, and so many of the questions that I think you all are going to come up with, are so crucial and not easy to answer, and maybe don't have an answer, or maybe the answer changes over time depending on your experiences. And so I'm here to share what I've learned on my journey, but I'm also here to learn from everyone else too. I'm constantly adapting my own strategies and skills. So super happy to be here from all fronts here. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for that, Natalie. And Caesar, we can also have you share a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Pedro, for the welcome. My name is Caesar. I am a Cal graduate, 2005. I use he, him pronouns. After graduating from Cal, I went to grad school and got a master's degree in psychology, became a licensed therapist, practiced for a few years, decided to switch career paths. So I went to law school and then became an attorney. And right now I work at Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders LLP, which is a large law firm. And I do mergers and acquisitions, renewable energy project development, and project finance. So I've had experience in two very, very different kind of careers. And I think this panel is really important because throughout my kind of career trajectory, I've really underestimated the importance of mentorship and having people that you can turn to. And I just wanted to make myself available as a resource to anybody who's interested.
Thank you so much, Cesar. And again, another thank you to our 4 panelists for introducing. And Aria, we can get you just to start formulating your response for our first question. Aria, if you could share how you feel like your lived experiences as a member of the LGBTQ plus community have shaped you in your career and in your own personal spaces.
Yeah, and before I realized I should actually say what I do, not just my title, because my job is really confusing for a lot of people. So basically, I manage this year-long fellowship for community leaders and advocates to teach them the California legislative process. And so we put them into teams by different issue areas like criminal justice and like police reform. And we help them introduce a bill and push that forward to get it signed. And they also have mentors. And so we have like different retreats, and we're basically introducing them to different trainers and things like that. So that's what I do. But I've only been there for 2 years. And so I graduated from Berkeley in 2017, which is pretty recent. And so I definitely feel like I'm in the beginning stages of learning what it even means like to navigate your career. And especially in this past year with the pandemic, just realizing so much about how much boundaries are important, and especially like those identities that you carry. And so I really appreciate this question because I studied English at Cal. And so I was involved in a lot of community spaces and like creative spaces. And for me, when I graduated, my goal was to honestly like not have work become my life and to follow just like my dreams of pursuing writing. But the reality of surviving the Bay hit me pretty hard. And like my first route was kind of like, oh, I think maybe I'll also try like the law route because I have an English degree and I love to like argue and like fight for like rights and things like that. But I quickly realized that wasn't for me. And one of the reasons I realized that wasn't for me was because I kind of felt like I just couldn't fully be me in that environment. And also that I didn't feel like it was a workers' compensation firm. And so we were advocating for workers, right? But it still didn't feel like my people. And I realized how important that is for me to really be in a work environment and have colleagues that I feel like seen by, and also knowing that I'm contributing to my communities in some way. And so I kind of landed at my current role because I was actually working also after I left the law firm, I started going like the corporate route and was also kind of just curious about trying it out. And I think that's also like a part of what came for me from my identities, like not being afraid to just like fail, like not being afraid to try things. And like also just used to being an outsider. So kind of just like, let me see like what works for me. And like I remember like the first day after I got hired, I had like this Medusa piercing like right on my face. And my supervisor was like, can you take that out? And this was like after I had gotten hired. So just things like that and like microaggressions where I definitely wasn't out, like I wasn't even out as queer in this role. And then just knowing like how uncomfortable I was really pushed me to like, okay, I need to really figure out like what I want to do. And so I started looking into the nonprofit industry. And immediately like I found the Women's Foundation and saw on their website how they really talked about like being intersectional and serving those who are most impacted and really prioritizing them. And the solutions that they can come up with like via policy and investing in community-led organizations. And so for me, like that immediately felt like it really rang true for me and where I could actually be my full self. And so I've been there for 2 years now. And like, I'll be honest, my first like 6 months, I didn't even really feel comfortable like fully showing up as me, because it was like my first time actually having the opportunity to be in an environment where I wasn't like the only queer person. And it was still hard for me. Like I had been a little like traumatized from like my year and a half out of Berkeley and like being in these jobs where I didn't really feel like I could be like my non-binary like queer self. And so after about like my first like year, I kind of realized that I was actually not using my identities as well as I could in actually my role, because we also serve non-binary and trans folks. And I realized that there was a lot of like misgendering going on, or just like not understanding some of our fellows and the identities that they hold. And so like I actually quickly realized like being non-binary is actually a huge asset in this case, because I can hold space for these fellows, and I can also advocate on behalf of them to my supervisor. And so yeah, that's kind of where I'm at now in terms of showing up as like me, and just knowing that I couldn't do it without developing really intimate relationships with certain colleagues, and also having a supportive supervisor, and also knowing that I'm really lucky with who with the org that I'm in, where folks can like show up, and like some folks have wives who are like lesbians and out. And so yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for all that wonderful insight, Ari. I feel like for me as well as a gay man, I feel like I always like take pride now in being out, because I know when I was in high school and even when I first came into college, it was something I wasn't as comfortable with. So I definitely resonate with that, with like finally coming to terms with your sexuality and being comfortable being out. So now I'd like to pass it on to Derry, if you'd like to share some insight with all of us tonight as well.
Thank you. I think I want first. I knew I was gay when I was like in the 6th grade. But it was really clear when I was growing up in East Oakland that I was getting subtle messages that little Black boys should not be gay. And so I just hid it. And I would say that some of my closest friends knew that I was gay in college, but a lot of people didn't. Only my closest friends knew. And it was very difficult. It was exhausting to kind of always speak in the third person and not be specific about what I did over the weekend and who I did it with. I would just be very vague. And that's really exhausting. But this really came to a head. I used to be a teacher, and the first year I was teaching, there was actually a ballot on the California state ballot called the Briggs Initiative, which was an initiative that would have banned gay and lesbian people from being teachers. And that was my first year of being a teacher. And Harvey Milk at the time was the major person that was fighting against this initiative. And that was when I realized that I was going to have to fight for the things that I wanted to do in my life. And I had to organize my other teachers. I had to talk to my administrators, just to see how much support that I had in the school that I was working in. Fortunately, I was working in an independent school, which wasn't going to be as influenced by like the public school system was going to be, but it was still very hard. So it was the first time I felt that the government was actually going to take a personal attack of me. And that's when I decided that I had to work in places and work with people who were going to be supportive of me in the most complete way. The other thing I will say in my introduction is I lived with my partner for 21 years. And we live in San Francisco and in Italy. So there's also some challenges when you're traveling around the world with your partner. And I'm happy to talk about that later too. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Derry. And now we can move on to our second question, where we would love to hear more from Natalie and Caesar. And for this question, if y'all could share your perspective on how you were able to prepare yourself for postgrad and then for your career journey afterwards.
Sure. So this is Natalie. I think prepare could be an interesting word with a lot of different interpretations. And I don't know that I was in a place when I graduated to know how or what to prioritize when looking for work outside of the work itself being meaningful to me. As for whether or not my identities were meaningful to the workplace, that was a completely different question that I don't know that I was ready to ask myself that. And part of that, I think, was fueled by the dynamic I had at school. I came into school as someone who was raised on a res, and I also have a very big, wonderful, amazing dad who is also a Black man from Nashville, Tennessee. And this was just a completely different space for all of us to engage, me going to college, and not just going to college, but going to Berkeley. And I think I got out of Berkeley thinking, how the heck did I make it through that place without them catching on and realizing that I wasn't supposed to be there? And so, and I don't think it's imposter syndrome. It's more of a cumulative effect of microaggressions that you just face all the time. And so I think that was part of the challenge. And then going out to work, it was like, hopefully someone will hire me now that I have this stamped on a resume. And so I don't think I was in a place to ask the questions that I ask myself now in engaging jobs. So that's one thing I would definitely share out, is that if you can find those resources or find those people to say, what questions are you asking yourself now as you engage with workplaces, that's invaluable, because I didn't have that when I graduated. And so that's one piece I'd love to flag. And then that being said, I think one of the biggest challenges I had going into workplaces is that there's a complex relationship between the professionalism and the intimacy of a workplace, in that the workplace is a place I can't control. It's an external entity that, in the name of commerce and capitalism, I have to engage, right? I need to make a salary. I need to have income to support myself and to support the causes that are important to me and to support the communities that are important to me. And so, and I don't make those rules. Those are just the rules around us, right? And so this is something that, when I was thinking about how to develop relationships that could hear out the challenges I was facing with my own identities, whether it was racial, national, LGBTQ, any one of those orientations, womanhood, all of these pieces, it was very difficult for me to know if the folks who were going through the same environment as me were resources for me. That was always difficult to learn and to discover. And I think that is also something you can't control. Like, I can't control how long, if I adore my supervisor, for example, I can't control when they move on, when they get promoted, when they move to a different campus or a different job or role. And so trying to establish, for me, it was about establishing external relationships, so relationships outside of work that could affirm my identities and my challenges, even though they weren't having the exact same experience as me. I think I oftentimes was tended to seek those resources in the workplace, to find a colleague who was navigating the same barriers as me, but that's not always possible, especially when you have so many identities that are so marginalized. And so that's one thing, is that I really, really leaned into and on my personal relationships, specifically with folks in the queer community, and then also on local resources. So, if there was a queer centering art show, sometimes that was the best place for me to find some of the best quotes or resources, or just like motivational speeches that kept me going through the next week or two. And that was, I would say, absolutely critical to my ability to navigate, especially some of my workspaces that were far more discriminatory than others. And so that's one thing I would flag, is if you can develop those personal relationships outside of work that are more stable, and I would say are relationships you probably have more agency in. I can't say how much that offered me the stability and the safety to feel affirmed and to keep showing up at work more myself each day. So I'll stop it there. But yeah, that's probably the best piece of advice I could offer on that front.
I'll step in at this point. So I had a similar experience to Natalie when I first graduated. As I was approaching kind of May and graduation, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was a psychology major, and so I was kind of in this place where I just knew I needed to get a job. And I wanted it to be in San Francisco because I wanted to be in kind of a more liberal environment. And those were my two goals, and those were the things that were most important to me at the time. I was entering the workforce when the job market wasn't particularly great, and so it was kind of like desperate times. At the time I was looking for a job, and so I honestly found my job online, and just went for it. I liked the people that I work with. I kind of just relied on my gut, and you know, during the interview I got to meet everybody I would be on a team with, and decided to go for it because I liked the workplace, and it felt right to me at the time. Fast forward 10 years later, as I'm preparing to graduate law school, I realized that kind of not knowing what you were doing and just jumping for whatever probably wasn't the best plan going out of law school. And so I kind of also did what Natalie did, which was I relied on the resources that I had available to me at the time, which were very close friends who I knew were in the legal industry, and I relied on them to connect me to people who I could talk to, who kind of knew the places I want to work and the spaces that I wanted to be in. And I think as you're starting to think about what the next step for you is after graduation, it's really important to tap into the resources that you already have, but also the resources that you already have but haven't had access to. Like, one of the things that I regret most about my time at Cal was really not using like the Career Center. That's something that I really regret not doing, because I know that they have resources that I don't even know exist. And that would have been super helpful for me. One of the things that became extraordinarily important to me as I was coming out of law school, and I went to law school in Orange County, which is not known for being a particularly liberal county, was being in a space and being at a law firm that affirmed my identity. And you're not going to really get a sense of whether or not a firm is going to work well for you just by looking at a website sometimes. Because if you look at a bunch of these firms' mission statements, and if you look at a bunch of corporations' mission statements, and if you look at their diversity statements, they all start to look the same after a while. And so for me, it was really important for me to kind of have some inside information into the industry, and that's where I relied on kind of my friends and the connections I was able to make through them to get a sense of what it would be like at specific firms. And kind of through that process is how I ended up where I am now. So yeah, what you're looking at kind of shifts over time, and what's going to be most important to you as you're looking for a job is going to shift over time. But I would definitely encourage you to make sure that you're utilizing the resources that you have, whether that's professional resources or personal resources such as friendships and the connections you've kind of made along the way.
Thank you so much for that, Caesar and Natalie. And now I'd like to open it up to all four of the panelists. If y'all want to share, since Caesar did bring up like resources and relationships, what type of resources or relationships y'all were able to tap into post-grad that you feel like really facilitated or helped you in your exit from your undergrad experience?
I actually, to what Caesar said, I actually, in my last semester was the first time I ever actually went to the Career Center. And I can't remember who I spoke to, but she just gave me really good advice about how to write a cover letter. I basically showed her what I had applied to this job on campus, and or I wanted to apply to a job on campus, and I had written this cover letter, and she kind of just went through with me on like why it wasn't so great. And that's not how she worded it, but she really taught me that you really actually need to thoroughly read like all of the duties and responsibilities, and in your cover letter really attest to how you've actually already done that before. And another thing that she also really encouraged me to do, which is what I did when I applied to the job I have now, is really show how you already understand what they're trying to do. Because companies get a lot of resumes, and I know at least at my organization and the organization I worked at prior, it was really the cover letter that that they really paid attention to once you got into the door with the resume that you had. And so definitely use the Career Center. That was very helpful for me. And to this day, like I love reading like friends' cover letters. I've also like helped hire at my org. And I will say that like most of the time when we read a cover letter, if we just felt like this person didn't actually like fully read through or really show us that they knew who we were trying to serve, definitely put us off on that person. So that's one resource I would say to utilize. And there's a lot of great stuff online too.
I would I would add a couple of things, and I'm like Cesar, you know, my first job out of business school was different than my second job. My first job, because I was a teacher and I was moving into business, it was more important for me to work for a reputable company. So the reputation of the company for me in my first job was more important than the culture of the company, because I needed to get some work experience in the field of business. And at the time, so I went to HP, that was my first company. But the slogan at HP was, what you do outside of work is your business, is your own business. And that was a subtle way of them telling us, don't bring tricky, controversial stuff into the workplace. I learned over time, if you go to people's desks and you see if they have pictures of their family up, the gay people that I knew there did not have pictures of, well, first, there weren't a lot of pictures up in people's offices. And there certainly weren't pictures of gay people in their offices. So I think you can see, when you're going through the interview process, you can see symbols in people's offices. You can notice pictures. My next job, which was at Levi's, which was the total opposite. Their slogan was, bring your whole self to work. And so when you went in people's offices, you saw pictures, you saw rainbow flags, you saw pictures of babies, you saw everything in those offices. And they would ask you questions about your hobbies and what you did on the weekends, because they wanted to know, they wanted you to have a whole life. So you can tell in the interview process what people want to know about you and what they don't want to know about you. And so by the time I went to Levi's after working 8 years at HP, I decided the next job I would have, I would be out at work right from the beginning. So even in the interview process, I was talking about my partner. I was saying, I live in San Francisco with my partner, and I was looking to see how they would react. And if they kind of jerked back a little bit, that was information for me to decide if it mattered or not. So I think you can notice those things through the interview process. And that helped me decide how and where I would go. And as I continued to move from company to company, I just continued to use that method, and that really served me well. I also disagree. Your supervisors come and go, but the cultures of the companies don't shift that quickly. So you might have a supervisor come and go, but the culture of the company doesn't shift very quickly. So if you find one that you like, I think it's easier to kind of hang out and navigate there for a while.
Thank you so much for that, Derry. That's actually a perfect transition for our next question for the panelists. So Ari, Natalie, and Cesar, if y'all could jump in for this portion as well. In that same vein, like, how do you identify if like an employer or an internship or anyone that you are interviewing is like inclusive or welcoming of LGBTQ plus or by POC folks? And then how do you determine in that like same thread if that job or that space like is a right fit for you and the identities that you carry?
I can start. um, so, in kind of the law firm context, one of the things that I tend to look for when I'm looking for a new job is they actually have to publish a lot of, well, they have the option to, but it looks bad if they don't, publish the diversity statistics of who is working at the firms. And so that's something I definitely look at. One thing that I would suggest is that when you're looking, and if your agency or wherever you're trying to work has published these numbers, is to not only look at the diversity in kind of the frontline workers and the entry level workers, but also look at the diversity in leadership, because they're the ones who are going to make the big decisions. And so you want to make sure that you're going to have allies who are supervising you and who are above you and kind of the work ladder. Like Derry, one of the things that I definitely do is pay attention to how people are reacting to me in interviews. One of the things that I sometimes ask when I'm interviewing at a firm, or even before that, wherever I was interviewing, is as I had kind of mentioned previously, like a lot of the diversity statements look the same, and they all have a diversity committee and something like that. I ask them what initiatives the diversity committee is working on, because their response to that is going to show you whether or not they're just paying lip service to the diverse communities that are entering the firm, or if they're actually doing something about it. I think those are the two kind of big things I'm looking for. And as I go through interviews, I'm definitely paying attention to how they're reacting to me, and I'm also looking at kind of the published numbers as I'm looking at new jobs. So those are the things that I do in my current line of work.
This is Natalie. I definitely agree with the sentiment that's been shared, that the websites can be really misleading and can be more of a campaign or an advertisement, as opposed to a true reflection of what you might experience or truly go through working for that space, or working with these folks as colleagues or as supervisors or whatever. And so I do think that I've been fortunate enough to have worked in nonprofit slash city county services, that I have a network where I can ask enough folks with 6 degrees of separation that someone will have some knowledge of what that space might feel like or look like. I didn't have that right away. And so again, I think this goes back to the first question I responded to, just in terms of having that network. So knowing who to ask, knowing what that can mean. And I think that's been one of the best channels or best resources I've been able to rely on, to know if a space might see or acknowledge all of the different things that I'm bringing to an office or bringing to work at any given moment. I think I've had the experience of going to workspaces where they'll compartmentalize those things, or expect me to compartmentalize those things, even if that wasn't implied on the website, or maybe wasn't even implied in the interview. And so knowing someone who's had to work with them in a meaningful way, and not just worked with them on their best day, but worked with them on their worst day, that's been so useful for me. And then another thing that's been really crucial for me, maybe it's because I work in like smaller nonprofit spaces or smaller nonprofit offices, is that for us, when we have an organizational shift or change, it tends to impact the org chart. And then all of the ways in which who I'm working with the most, or who has the power over my salary or my performance evaluation, that can shift depending on whatever organizational method or strategy they want to deploy at that moment. Those types of things I can't anticipate. And so that's become something that I've started to ask, is just, how often should I expect structural change within the organization, so that I don't settle with something such as believing that my supervisor is going to be my supervisor forever. Because maybe if someone who's told me like, hey, go work here, this person's great and is going to send you to professional development training that's based on your identities, that's going to make sure that they cultivate that for you as a part of your work experience, if that's a buy-in for me to really apply to the space, and then that could change within 6 months, I might want to reconsider what that means and how I prioritize that space in sort of my ranking or in how I consider going there. Yeah, so for me, again, I'm just going to reiterate, knowing folks who have been able to work with them. And like I said, not on their best day, not when they're on Zoom doing a public announcement on behalf of their org, but when something's gone wrong, terribly wrong, organizationally wrong, what are they like, and who do they pursue first from a power standpoint at work, and really knowing that information has been vital for my basically enduring these spaces a lot of the times. Yeah, so that's what I'll share out on that.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And oh, thank you, Derry. I was about to pass it on to you and Aria as well.
Well, I also would just add to what's been said. I always got involved in employee organizations once I got inside, because it was a way for me to influence policy in the company. I mean, I was not a senior person. By the time I left, I was a senior person, but there was a Black Employee Association. There was an LGBTQ organization. And so we designed things for the company. We would invite speakers. Of course, there's Black History Month, but there was Gay Pride Month, and we would run all those sessions, and we would invite executives to come in and talk to us about our experience there, and we would tell them what we needed and what we wanted. And so I just let you know, I always worked in big old Fortune 100 companies. So, you know, lots of hierarchy, you know, lots of employees. You know, HP had 80,000 employees, Levi's had 20,000 employees, Genentech had 20,000 employees. So I had to get in the organizations that were kind of the place where the executives went if an issue happened. They would come to us first. So when I was there, for example, at Levi's, there was the Rodney King incident, which in the LA riot, you know, they came to us because we, you know, the company was kind of in disarray. When Harvey Milk got assassinated, you know, they had to come to the LGBTQ committee to help navigate what needed to be done. And so I was glad I was in those organizations. I was one of the officers in those organizations. And that was also a way for me to meet senior people in the company and for them to get to meet me so that I could try to influence and have a voice in what was happening. So I would encourage you to be active in your companies so that you can shape the culture of the company.
We can transition into our next question as well. And Ari, maybe we can start off with you for this one. So in that same thread of what we've been discussing, how are you able to navigate a workspace while being true to yourself and your values and identities? And also, how can you advocate for yourself or others while you are in the workspace?
Yeah, this is a question I ask of myself often. And I really like what Derry just said, because one of the ways that I decided to be aligned with my values was by starting a union with my colleagues, and which was really scary. I didn't even really know like what unions really were beyond the high school, like AP US history understanding when I started. And this also kind of goes back to like, you can't tell everything from a website, right? And so, yeah, I think it was actually like my first day, the woman who was training me kind of told me that some folks had been wanting to unionize, and it was mostly to hold the foundation accountable to the values that we espouse. And it was really scary for me because it was my first day, and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want people to hate me or think that I'm like here as an infiltrator. And so what I had to do literally my first day off was I was like, I'll think about it. And I had to ask myself, like, what are my values? What do I believe in? Like, do I want to potentially create lasting change with with these colleagues that I barely know, but I feel like I understand where they're coming from, and I can trust that they're doing this out of faith that organizations can always do better. Or do I kind of want to like let fear stop me from actually embodying my values? And so this is like a practice that I still do often, is actually just make sure I'm pausing and defining what my values are and seeing if I'm actually embodying those values. So like one of my values is to practice non-direct, or not non-direct, but direct nonviolent communication. And like I have to be really honest with myself about that sometimes, because when we're in a virtual world, it's really hard to like sometimes not just kind of write out a message on Slack, right? Or even on like email. And so like that's one thing that I would recommend to you, is also as you're looking for a job, is ask like what kind of company values are you really looking for? Like what are your values, and do you feel like it aligns when you're in the interview? And also really making sure in like the interview to also ask like what is your company's values, and to ask those questions about the culture. And the second thing is also like checking in on what your boundaries are with yourself, and making sure that you're sticking to that. It's kind of like a blessing and a curse to practice that in the work environment, but it's been really helpful for me. And sometimes advocacy looks like, you know, asking for a sick day, and maybe you're not sick, but it's for your mental health. But if you have it, like use it. Like it looks like using your vacation days. I think as Berkeley students and like Berkeley grads, we're all very hard on ourselves. And you also have to remember, like, everything doesn't fall on your shoulders. So for me, like, I chose like one thing, which is like the union work, and I'm like sticking to that. You know, we have like different like committees at my job, but I'm also need to like cultivate passions outside of that, right? And like build community outside of that. Because for me, it was always really important not just to be my job and what I do. And so, yeah, I'll make space for the other panelists to answer.
Thank you. So approaching the end of time for this before we move into our breakout rooms, I'd like to transition it. I'm so sorry, Derry, if y'all want to still answer this question or the final thoughts portion, y'all can address it here. But just before we end this segment, if y'all can also share what's the best career advice you have ever given and that y'all would like to share with all of us here. And if we could start with Natalie as well, and then transition it to Derry, Caesar, and Ari.
Sure. So the best career advice I've ever received is just a reminder that the workplace is built around a structure of labor. And so knowing that we can build invaluable relationships in those spaces, and also recognizing that the workspace is not necessarily an organic environment and not an organic culture. And so the culture has to be cultivated. And if you can play a role in that safely, or a role in that knowing that advocacy, you know, comes with risks, that all can be invaluable work. And I think keeping that in mind, just knowing that if you feel out of place at the workplace, in many ways that the workplace is designed to make people feel out of place. And so just knowing that you aren't alone in that struggle. And whatever you choose to do will be the right decision as long as it's for you. If it means that you keep that intimacy to yourself so that you can endure the space, if it means that you advocate for yourself, whatever you choose to do that gets you, that takes care of your mental health and gets you the resources you need, that's perfectly okay. So definitely that was helpful for me. So that's one thing I'll definitely like to share.
I would say someone told me the people that you see on the way up are the same people that you'll see on the way down. And so for me, that meant to always be respectful, don't burn bridges, because you never know who you're going to be working with and who you're going to be working for, and who is going to be working for you. Because by the time I left, I was leading a big part of the company, and I'm so happy that I was respectful for all these people that I met along the way, because ultimately some of them started working for me. And some of them were not friendly, but I chose to take the high road. And that always served me well. So, and then some of the people that were mean to me actually ended up working for me. And that was a lesson that they had to learn, because they remembered some times where they had been inappropriate with me. And now here I was, their coach, their leader, their manager. So I think it's important to just be respectful. And that was good counsel for me. Thanks.
Derry kind of took the words out of my mouth as far as not burning bridges with anybody. So I'll go with another piece of advice that I got, which was try as much as possible to make yourself indispensable in the workplace. And, you know, for me, what that has involved has been kind of finding cracks in knowledge or an expertise within the workspace. And what that does for you is it makes your firm or your company want to keep you around for as long as possible. It'll make them want to promote you and kind of work with you so that you do have longevity in the company. And not only that, they may even consider you for promotion. So that's my advice.
Yeah, for me, it was actually the director of the MCC who just really grounded me in knowing that it's okay to have a nonlinear journey. It's okay to kind of try like various different jobs, and like that's actually helpful because you kind of find along the way what you want, what you don't want, what you're willing to put up with, what you're not willing to put up with. So I definitely stick to that, and it was hard to remember that sometimes, but it's really hard graduating and just like going and finding a job, and you know, you go from like being really grounded in community to maybe not as much anymore. And so just like having grace for yourself and just knowing that it's okay. Like they call it a career journey for a reason.
Thank you all so much for your wonderful feedback. And I feel like, yeah, I definitely resonate with everything all of you shared, especially as I am also like nearing graduation, and other attendees might also be in that stage, just like deciding what to do after. And I feel like also like my family's expectations, and they're like, what are you going to do after? Like, you know, I feel like a lot of people often assume that once you graduate, you're just going to make a whole lot of money, and it doesn't work out like that. But yeah, thank you for all your insight.